In Agile, a risk is anti-value. Unlike the traditional approach, risks in Agile are only negative events. There are no opportunities considered as part of risk management in Agile projects. So risk is always an anti-value. Therefore, managing risk is critical for value-driven delivery in Agile projects. As a result, Agile teams need to balance the goals of delivering business value and reducing risk each time they select a new batch of features or stories to work on. So it's not enough to consider the value we are expecting from a feature, but it is also important to consider the risk associated with developing this user story. As the project continues, the team will also need to continually assess the severity of the project threats and monitor the overall project risk profile. This is part of the development team, Scrum Master, and Product Owner responsibilities. Now, Agile teams manage threats and issues by examining 3 tools. So we have 3 tools that can help us manage threats and risk profile in the project. The first one is the risk-adjusted backlog. The second is the risk severity, and the third is the risk burn-down graphs. And I will cover the 3 tools in this lecture. Bear in mind that in Agile, risk generally refers to threats and issues that could negatively impact the project, as opposed to the PMBOK definition, which includes positive risks or opportunities. So risks in Agile are only anti-value events. They are threats and issues. Starting with the risk-adjusted backlog, in planning each iteration, Agile teams seek to balance delivering the highest value features and mitigating the biggest risks that remain on the project. Agile teams need to keep an eye on both delivering the highest value items at the top of the product backlog. At the same time, we want to mitigate the risks with the biggest impact on the project. They do this by moving the items with the greatest value and risk to the top of their product backlog. So the idea of using the risk-adjusted backlog is considering the risk response planning efforts within the backlog prioritization exercise. The backlog might start out as just a list of business features involved in the project, divided into practical bundles of work. But once the risk response activities are added and prioritized based on their anti-value, it can be referred to as a risk-adjusted backlog. So a regular product backlog will have the user stories or the items prioritized as per the expected business value of each item. When you add the risk mitigation activities and efforts into this backlog and reprioritizing the items considering into account the risk response planning activities, it will be known as a risk-adjusted backlog. This list will help the Agile team focus on both value delivery and risk reduction activities. So the idea is dealing with risk reduction activities as part of the project scope. Most project teams are comfortable with ranking customer requirements on the basis of business value and risk level. So examples explained in previous sections were all focusing on the business value of each item and giving a priority number based on this business value. Now I will show you an example of a risk-adjusted backlog considering into account the risk level in the project. Agile teams will start building the risk-adjusted backlog by using the return on investment per feature. After business representatives have attributed a dollar value to each of the product features, we can prioritize those features based on the business value. This is the first step in developing the product backlog. So here is an example of a product backlog features prioritized as per the value. Next, we need some way to monetize the risk avoidance and risk mitigation activities. To get this figure, we can calculate the expected monetary value of each risk. So let's assume you met the customer and you obtained the expected business value of each user story in the product backlog from them. And then you prioritize this backlog items based on the expected business value. You will have this shape. This is a prioritized product backlog with 7 user stories. Now we want to consider the impact of the important risks or the key risks in the project. So we will determine the expected monetary value of each identified risk in our Agile project by multiplying the risk impact in dollars by the risk probability as a percentage. Using this approach, we can rank the project risks to produce a prioritized list of threats and issues ordered by the expected monetary value. So, as we had earlier a prioritized list of product backlog items based on their expected business value, we will develop a prioritized list of risks based on their expected monetary value. So, assuming we have 7 risks in this project, the probability and the impact of each risk is known, and we calculated the expected monetary value by applying this formula, the expected monetary value of each risk, and we prioritized those risks based on their expected monetary value. This is the list you will have. The risk-adjusted backlog is about merging both the features prioritized by business value and the expected monetary value of each risk. Threats and issues prioritized by expected monetary value. Okay, this is the prioritization. And then earlier we developed a list of the product backlog items prioritized as per their expected business value, and we want now to merge both and prioritize them. Here is the risk-adjusted backlog, considering both requirements or items and the risk action plans. So for example, the risk 1 action expected monetary value is $4,500. It will come between requirements 1 and 2. For risk 2 action, it's $4,000. Also, it will become between requirements 1 and 2, and so on, till we have a risk-adjusted backlog considering both the requirements, user stories, and the risks. This is a risk-adjusted backlog. The second tool in dealing with threats is the risk severity. Risks are generally assessed via 2 measures: risk probability, which is a measure of how likely a risk to occur, and risk impact, which is a measure of the consequences to the project should the risk actually occur. These are the 2 factors or the 2 dimensions we heavily rely on in order to assess the risks on our project: the probability of occurrence and the impact in case the risk occur. Agile teams need to continue to monitor risks and track the effectiveness of their risk reduction efforts. This is the responsibility of the whole Agile team. Now, there is a drawback of using the expected monetary value formula, which I explained earlier. It can be tempting to focus too much on the exact dollar amounts rather than the relative value of each risk. And this is the drawback which we will avoid by using the risk severity tool. To help us avoid the problem, there is another metric we can use to rank the risks and determine risk response priorities, known as the risk severity. So, to calculate the risk severity, instead of using risks probability, percentage, and dollar impact, we instead rank its probability and impact on a simple scale such as a low 1, medium 2, and high 3. Then we multiply those probability and impact rankings to calculate the risk severity. So the risk severity is more subjective rather than the expected monetary value. The expected monetary value is a math formula. Here we will provide a rating for the probability and a rating for the impact, and we will multiply both ratings to determine the risk severity. So the risk severity is the risk impact multiplied by the risk probability as rating. For example, let's say we decide to rank the probability and impact of our risks on a 3-point scale. Scale number 1 is low, scale number 2 is medium, and scale number 3 is high. Using this scale, a risk that has a high probability and a high impact will have a risk severity of 9, because a high probability is 3 and a high impact is 3. So 3 by 3 is 9. On the other hand, a risk that has high probability and low impact will have a risk severity of 3, because a high probability is 3 and a low impact is 1. So this is how we can calculate the risk severity. We start by doing an analysis of the risks so that we can assign a probability and impact score to each one. Then we use those scores to calculate the severity of each risk. As the project progresses, the team can expand the initial analysis to record how their attempts to manage the project risks are working. The next chart shows the progress of the risks over the first 4 months of a project. So we determined the risk severity for 4 risks in the project, and we monitored this severity throughout the project. So you can see For example, that for risk ID number 1, the severity of this risk in January was 6, in Feb it's 0. So the probability of this risk became 0, either because this risk is now outdated or because we took an action and made the probability of this risk 0. During these 4 months, many of the project risks were mitigated or avoided. For example, the first risk ended up not being a problem, and the risk severity of this risk went from 6 to 0. Now, the third and the last tool we can use to manage threats in the project is the risk burn down graph, which is something similar to the risk burn down or to the project burn down chart. Due to the long lists of risks identified, and to make the data easier to grasp at a glance, we can convert numbers into a risk burn down graph. So it's a visual representation of the risk profile in the project. This is a risk burn down chart, and it is similar to the burn down chart we use to monitor the project iterations, progress and status and velocity. It shows the remaining risk profile in the project. This is why it's known as the burn down. It will show the remaining risk profile in the project. Risk burn down graphs are essentially stacked area graphs of cumulative project risk severity. So it's cumulative, considering all the project individual threats. The severity scores for each risk are plotted on one on top of another to show the project's cumulative severity profile. When risks and their history of severity are displayed in this format, it's much easier to interpret the overall risk status and trends of the project. Risk burn down graphs quickly inform stakeholders whether the risks are moving in the right direction, which should be downward in a burn down chart, or if they are escalating. Although project risk is not a core metric like features delivered, it's useful to track. We always focus our tracking efforts on the delivered features and user stories, but you need to consider the risk profile in the project. And for tracking as an information radiator, the best tool is the risk burn down chart. Agile teams need to actively control their risks, since the effectiveness of their risk reduction efforts ultimately impacts whether they successfully maximize value in the project or not. So we can manage threats in our projects, Agile projects, using the risk adjusted backlog, using the risk severity and the risk burn down chart.